Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're really getting into the weeds of early Christianity. It's a period that's, well, way more complex and maybe surprising than most people think.
That's right. And we're using Bart Ehrman's book, Lost Christianities, as our main guide here. It's quite a ride.
It really is. And for you listening, maybe you want the deep knowledge but don't have, weeks to read everything.
Yeah, think of this as your shortcut. We've dug into Ehrman, looked at reviews, other resources, basically trying to give you the core insights fast.
Exactly. Because the big takeaway from Ehrman is that early Christianity wasn't this single unified thing. He calls it a chaos of contending beliefs.
Which is a great phrase.
Isn't it? So our mission really is to explore that chaos, understand the sheer variety of beliefs, the fights that happened, and how one view eventually, won out.
And fair warning, it might challenge some common assumptions about how Christianity all started.
Okay, let's jump right in. Ehrman's main point, and it's a big one, is that the diversity wasn't just minor stuff. It was radical.
Yeah, we're talking totally different ideas about God, creation, Jesus himself, fundamental things.
People often picture it like a tree trunk, right? Original Christianity and then heresies branching off later.
Right, the traditional view. But Ehrman, he flips that. He says it's more like
parallel saplings. That's his image.
Exactly. Multiple distinct Christian movements growing up side by side right from the very beginning.
So not deviations, but different starting points altogether.
Precisely. And these weren't small disagreements. I mean, some groups might have believed in, well, multiple divine beings, not the single God that became standard.
Wow. Okay.
Others thought the world wasn't made by the ultimate God, but by some lesser, maybe even flawed entity.
And geez, that was a huge area of debate, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Was he human? Was he divine? Was he both? Was he just appearing to be human? All these ideas were floating around, and Ehrman argues they were there early on.
And this is key. Ehrman says this diversity was the original situation, not some later breakdown of unity.
Right. No initial golden age of perfect agreement that then fragmented. The fragmentation, or rather the multiplicity, was there from the start.
That really does shift things.
Yeah.
So if it was so diverse, how did we end up with the Christianity most people recognize today? That leads to proto-orthodoxy, right?
Exactly. That's Ehrman's term, proto-orthodox. It refers to the group whose beliefs eventually became mainstream.
Proto being the key part there. They weren't orthodox yet.
Not inherently, no. Ehrman stresses they were just one faction, one group among many, pushing their interpretation.
So what gave them the edge? How did they win? It wasn't just having the right ideas from day one.
No, Ehrman argues it was a process, a struggle, really. They debated theology, obviously.
Sure.
But they also did other things. They really pushed the idea of apostolic authority, claiming they had a direct line back to the original apostles.
Which is a powerful claim, right? Connecting back to the source.
Immensely powerful. They also focused on building church structures, getting organized. That helped coordinate things.
Okay, organization matters.
And crucially, they started selecting texts, promoting certain writings as authoritative scripture while sidelining others.
Ah, so the New Testament canon didn't just magically appear. It was part of this process, this struggle.
That's a core part of Ehrman's argument. The shaping of the canon was absolutely tied to the rise of this proto-Orthodox group. They championed the books that fit their theology.
It makes you think of that scholar Walter Bauer, whom Ehrman mentions. Bauer argued that in some places, what was later called heresy was actually the first form of Christianity there.
Exactly. It feeds into that idea that history, well, it often gets written by the winners, doesn't it?
Yeah, the dominant story isn't always the whole story, or even the original one.
And that's what Ehrman's getting at. The proto-Orthodox narrative became the narrative because they succeeded in establishing it.
So this picture of a straight line, a predetermined path to, say, the Nicene Creed, Ehrman really challenges that.
Completely. He presents it as much more contingent, more dependent on historical events and human actions. The outcome wasn't guaranteed.
Okay, so we've got this picture of massive diversity and one group, the proto-Orthodox, starting to gain ground. Let's make this diversity more concrete. What did some of these lost Christianities actually believe? Give us some examples.
Sure. Ehrman highlights several fascinating ones. Let's start with the Ebionites.
Okay.
These were Jewish Christians, very important. They stressed continuity with Judaism. They believed followers of Jesus still needed to follow the Mosaic laws, circumcision, dietary laws, the works.
So for them, being Christian didn't mean stopping being Jewish.
Not at all. They saw Jesus as the Messiah, but a human one. born naturally to Mary and Joseph, not divine in the way that later became Orthodox.
Wow, okay. So very much rooted in Jewish tradition.
Definitely. They represent one end of the spectrum, you could say.
What about the other end? Something radically different.
That would probably be the Marcionites. Followers of Marcion, around the mid-2nd century, they went in the complete opposite direction.
How so?
They rejected Judaism entirely throughout the Old Testament.
Whoa, what?
Marcion taught there were two gods, the creator God of the Old Testament. He saw him as like a lesser, judgmental, maybe even wrathful God.
Okay.
And then there was the supreme God, the Father of Jesus, who was all about love and mercy, totally separate. Jesus was his messenger.
So Jesus wasn't the Jewish Messiah for them?
No, not at all. And they believed Jesus wasn't truly human either. He only appeared to be human. That's called Docetism.
Appeared human, Docetism.
That.
Got it. So two gods, Jesus not really human, Old Testament out. That is radically different from the Ebionites.
Absolutely. And Marcion even made his own scripture. He took the Gospel of Luke, parts of Paul's letters, and basically cut out anything he thought sounded too Jewish, created his own mini-canon.
Making his own Bible, essentially, to fit his theology. That really shows the conflict over texts.
It really does. Then you have the Gnostics, and Gnostics is a trippy term because it covers a lot of different groups.
Right, not just one unified thing.
No, but many shared an emphasis on gnosis.
Secret knowledge.
Yeah, basically. A special, intuitive, maybe mystical knowledge needed for salvation, not just faith or good works in the same way.
Okay.
And many Gnostics had this dualistic worldview. The spiritual world is good, perfect, but the material world, our world, flawed, maybe even evil, created by a lower being, the demiurge, not the true ultimate God.
Sort of like Plato, but with a more negative view of the physical.
You can see potential influences there, yeah. Jewish mysticism, Platonism, it's complex. And their views on Jesus often lean towards Docetism, too. His physical body wasn't truly real or important.
And we know a lot more about them now because of Nag Hammadi, right?
Yeah.
Those texts they found in Egypt.
Exactly. Texts that's like the Gospel of Thomas. It's just sayings of Jesus, no story. Very different feel. Focuses on Jesus revealing secret wisdom.
And didn't it claim Thomas was Jesus' twin?
It does mention something like that, yeah. Shows you the different traditions floating around. Or think of the Gospel of Peter.
Oh, yeah, the one with the crosstalks.
That's the one. A different version of Jesus' death and resurrection. It just highlights how many different stories and interpretations existed.
What about others? Like the Acts of Paul and Thecla?
Right, that text shows different ideas about women's roles, asceticism, things that maybe clashed with what became the mainstream view in letters like 1 Timothy.
And there were others too, right? Like infancy gospels with stories of Jesus as a kid doing miracles?
Yeah, those show popular interest, folk piety. And then there's the whole issue of pseudepigraphy texts written in the name of famous figures, like apostles.
Ehrman calls those forgeries, which is a strong word.
It is, and it emphasizes his point about contested authority. People were writing texts claiming apostolic backing to support their own theological views. These weren't just side issues. These texts were central for these groups.
And their disappearance is tied to the proto-Orthodox winning out.
That's the argument. These lost texts reveal the diversity, and their obscurity is part of the story of how one version became dominant.
Okay, so Ehrman uses these texts, canonical and non-canonical, to build his case. But what about his method? Has that drawn any criticism from other scholars?
Oh, yes. While Ehrman's influential, his methodology in Lost Christianities definitely gets debated. One point that comes up is how he weighs the evidence.
Meaning?
Well, some critics feel he sometimes seems, let's say, more willing to trust details found in non-canonical texts, maybe texts that support his diversity thesis.
Like the twin thing in the Acts of Thomas you mentioned.
Perhaps. While at the same time, he might apply a more rigorous skepticism to traditional claims, like who wrote certain New Testament books. It raises questions for some about consistency. Is the skepticism applied evenly?
So it's about potentially trusting the unconventional sources more readily than the traditional ones.
That's the critique some scholars might level, yeah. The criteria for judging reliability applied the same way across the board. Another point is the dating of these alternative texts.
Are they really as early as he suggests?
That's often debated. Dating ancient texts is tricky. If these non-canonical Gospels or Acts are dated very early, it strengthens the argument for radical diversity right from the start. But if they're later, the picture might look different. And there isn't always consensus on those dates.
And his use of the word forgery.
That's another one. It's technically accurate. They weren't written by the named author. But forgery carries heavy negative baggage, implying deliberate deception.
Whereas pseudepigraphy was kind of a known literary convention back then, not always meant to deceive.
Some argue that yes, it could have been a way to honor a figure or claim legitimacy for a tradition associated with them. Calling it forgery paints a picture of conflict and underhanded tactics, which fits Ehrman's narrative, but might oversimplify the writer's intentions.
So the language itself shapes how we see it.
It definitely can. The overall critique sometimes boils down to methodological selectivity. Is the evidence being weighed in a way that perhaps favors the desired conclusion?
So while the core idea of early diversity is pretty much accepted, the specifics of Ehrman's reconstruction and his methods are definitely part of the ongoing scholarly conversation.
Absolutely. Interpreting this period involves navigating complex evidence, and different scholars will emphasize different aspects.
Okay, back to the story. We have diversity, we have the proto-Orthodox group rising. Ehrman calls this time, the 2nd and 3rd centuries especially, a period of battles. What did that look like?
Well, according to Ehrman, it was multi-pronged. There were, of course, the theological debates we mentioned, writing arguments, trying to persuade people.
Standard stuff.
Right. But also that heavy emphasis on apostolic succession. Our teachings come directly from the apostles, theirs don't. That was a key weapon.
Claiming the authentic lineage.
Exactly. And building those church structures, bishops, hierarchies helped create a more unified front, better communication, shared resources. They built alliances between communities that thought alike.
Getting organized, building a network.
Precisely. And then there was the aggressive side, heresiology. Writing specifically designed to attack and condemn rivals. Figures like Irenaeus or Tertullian weren't just explaining their own views, they were actively trying to dismantle the arguments of others.
So not just disagreement, but actively labeling others as dangerous heretics.
Yes. And Ehrman argues it went beyond just words. He contends the proto-Orthodox actively worked to suppress these other groups, to discredit their leaders, maybe even destroy their writings.
That's a big claim, active suppression and destruction. Is the evidence strong for that in these early centuries?
That's where it gets more complex, as we touched on. The rhetoric of condemnation is certainly there in the heresiologists. And later, especially after Constantine made Christianity tolerated and then favored, you definitely see state-backed suppression of non-Orthodox groups.
But before Constantine, in the 2nd and 3rd centuries,
direct evidence for widespread organized destruction of texts by the proto-Orthodox themselves is harder to come by. Ehrman often infers it from the harsh language and the fact that these texts did become scarce, but it's an inference.
So the text disappeared, but maybe not only because of deliberate suppression.
That's the counter-argument. Maybe some texts just weren't copied as much because they weren't as popular or useful.
Okay, so this suppression idea is central to Ehrman's battle narrative, linking it to why these other groups became lost.
Correct. He argues their victory involved silencing opponents. And this connects directly, again, to the New Testament canon.
How so?
The books chosen were the ones that aligned with proto-Orthodox theology. Books favored by Gnostics or Ebionites or Marcionites, they were excluded. The canon itself, in this view, is a monument to the winners of these battles.
So the Bible isn't just a collection of inspired texts everyone agreed on, but a product of historical conflict and selection.
That's the implication, yes. And Ehrman suggests that a degree of intolerance, a willingness to draw sharp lines and exclude others, was actually crucial for the proto-Orthodox success.
It paints a much more human, maybe even political picture of the early church.
It certainly emphasizes the role of conflict and power dynamics in shaping what we now know as Christianity.
So let's assess this. The evidence for diversity, pretty strong, right? Nag Hammadi, heresiologists' accounts.
Yes. The existence of groups like Ebionites, Marcionites, various Gnostic schools, that's widely accepted. The diversity is clear.
But the evidence for systematic, organized suppression and destruction of texts before Constantine, that's less conclusive, more debated.
It's generally considered less direct, yes. We have the strong condemnations, we know texts disappeared, but proving a coordinated effort at destruction across the empire in those early centuries is difficult. Correlation isn't necessarily causation.
So what are some alternative explanations for why these non-canonical texts faded or got excluded, besides active suppression?
Well, several possibilities exist. One is just practicality.
Practicality.
Yeah, churches needed a workable set of core scriptures for teaching, liturgy, settling disputes. You couldn't just keep adding texts indefinitely. Some selection was probably inevitable.
Okay, makes sense. A manageable core.
Another factor, perceived authenticity. Did a text seem genuinely connected to an apostle or the earliest tradition? Texts seen as later or legendary or theologically way out there might have been rejected on those grounds. Think of Bruce Metzger's view. Many apocryphal texts just didn't ring true historically or theologically to the main body of Christians.
So judgments about apostolicity and reliability.
Absolutely. And maybe limited appeal. Some texts might have been important to small groups or specific regions, but never caught on widely in major centers like Rome, Alexandria, or Antioch. They just didn't have the broad usage.
They just faded out from lack of interest.
Could be part of it. And related to that, maybe the proto-Orthodox framework itself, its theology, its narrative, its structure simply proved more coherent, more adaptable, or more appealing to more people over time.
So it wasn't just about pushing others down, but also about offering something compelling.
That's a perspective to consider, yes. It might have offered a better balance, say, between Jewish roots and Gentile inclusion, or a more grounded Christology than some of the more esoteric Gnostic views. Some critics even label Ehrman's strong emphasis on suppression as leaning towards a conspiracy theory, perhaps overstating the level of coordination possible in the early decentralized church.
Right. It's hard to prove a large-scale conspiracy back then.
It is. So it's likely a mix of factors. Theological debate, claims to authority, organizational strength, the perceived value and authenticity of texts, maybe some suppression, and simply the varying appeal of different messages. It's complex.
This whole discussion really circles back to the words heresy and orthodoxy. Ehrman's point is that these aren't fixed eternal categories, right?
Exactly. That's fundamental to his argument. He argues they're historical constructs. They got defined by the winners after the battles were largely won.
So heresy didn't always mean wrong belief.
Originally, the Greek word heresis just meant a choice, or a faction, or a school of thought, like the different schools of Greek philosophy. It wasn't automatically negative. It was the proto-Orthodox writers who increasingly loaded the term with negative meaning, using it to label groups they disagreed with as deviant and dangerous. The definition evolved through conflict.
So the winners got to define what was orthodox, right belief, and what was heretical, wrong choice belief.
Precisely. And the crucial implication Ehrman draws is that just because the proto-Orthodox view won doesn't automatically mean it was theologically correct or historically closer to Jesus' original message.
From a purely historical perspective, we can't necessarily say the Ebionites or Marcionites were wrong.
Historians, acting purely as historians, can describe the different beliefs and track who won the arguments, but they can't really make theological judgments about ultimate truth based solely on who prevailed historically. This really challenges the assumption that the dominant form of Christianity must be the most authentic one.
That's a really significant point. It implies that Christian doctrine wasn't just revealed or logically deduced, but was shaped by, well, human factors. Power, conflict, politics.
Yes. Theological reasoning played a role, obviously, but Ehrman argues that social conflicts, institutional power plays, rhetoric, and historical contingency were just as important in determining which version of Christianity survived and thrived. It relativizes orthodoxy.
It presents mainstream Christianity as one outcome among possibilities, an outcome shaped by very human struggles.
That's a good way to put it. One historical stream that became a river while others dried up or were dammed.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up, our deep dive into Ehrman's lost Christianities. What are the main things for people to take away?
I'd say first, just the sheer radical diversity of early Christianity. It wasn't monolithic at all.
Right. Fundamental disagreements on God, Jesus, Scripture.
Second, the orthodoxy we know today emerged from conflict. It wasn't the only option on the table initially. The proto-Orthodox group actively competed and eventually succeeded.
Through debates, organization, claiming authority, defining the canon.
Exactly. Which leads to the third point. The New Testament canon itself is a product of this historical process, reflecting the choices and the victory of one particular strand of early Christianity.
And we got glimpses of those other strands, Ebionites, Marcionites, Gnostics, through the non-canonical texts Ehrman brings to light.
And fourth, maybe, the understanding that terms like heresy and orthodoxy are themselves historical labels, defined by the winners.
We also touched on the scholarly debates around Ehrman's methods, the evidence for suppression versus other factors. It's not a closed case.
Definitely not. It's an ongoing field of study. But Ehrman's work undeniably challenges traditional narratives and forces a consideration of those faiths we never knew.
It really makes you rethink the origins.
It does. It prompts a more critical look at how traditions develop.
So maybe a final thought for everyone listening to mull over. If Christian tradition was shaped so much by this diverse and conflict-ridden history, by very human factors. How does that impact how you view that tradition or the authority of Scripture today?
And maybe broaden that out. What other lost perspectives from any tradition or period might still hold valuable insights if we looked for them?
That's a great question to leave people with. It definitely encourages looking beyond the dominant narratives.
Absolutely. And if this has intrigued you, definitely check out Ehrman's book, Lost Christianities, and maybe some of the responses to it. There's a lot more to explore.